Chapter 1. The Calm Before the Crack. The village of Marlecombe lay beneath a soft April sun, its lanes ribboned with daffodils and the faint hum of bees. To anyone passing through, it seemed the sort of place where time had forgotten to move forward. Cottages with thatched roofs, whitewashed walls, and smoke curling lazily from chimneys. Nothing ever happened in Marlecombe. Nothing ever changed. That was precisely why Miss Jane Marple, visiting her old friend Mrs. Weatherby for a fortnight, had chosen to take her afternoon tea by the bay window of the Willow Cottage sitting-room. She had always found that one could learn more about a village in an hour of quiet observation than from a week's worth of conversation. Across the lane, Mr. and Mrs. Trelawney were trimming their roses. Mr. Trelawney, as always, was lecturing his wife about the proper method of pruning, though the results of his efforts were invariably inferior to hers. Young Margaret Finch, the vicar's daughter, cycled past with a basket full of letters. She had taken to helping at the post office since poor Mr. Pike had his accident. Dr. Redmond's green motorcar rumbled by, raising a small puff of dust as it turned toward the lane leading to the Harcourt estate. Life went on as it always had, at least until that evening. It began, as these things often do, with something small. A scream. It was faint, coming from the direction of Harcourt House, that imposing Georgian mansion on the edge of the village green. Miss Marple, who had just finished her tea, looked up sharply. Mrs. Weatherby, who was knitting by the fire, dropped her needles. "My word," she said. That sounded like trouble. Trouble, in Marlecombe, was rare. By the time they reached the lane, half the village was already gathered in front of Harcourt House, the cook, the gardener, even old Mr. Trask from the pub. The local constable, Sergeant Fowler, had arrived and was attempting, somewhat ineffectively, to keep people back. "Go on now, nothing to see here," he said, red-faced. "Move along, everyone." But there was plenty to see. Through the drawing-room window, its curtains half-drawn, one could make out the body of a man lying on the carpet. A broken teacup glittered near his hand, and beside the window, faint but unmistakable, a single handprint smeared across the glass, as if pressed there by someone in a desperate moment. Miss Marple felt the faint chill of foreboding that had visited her too many times before. "Who is it?" whispered Mrs. Weatherby. "Mr. Harcourt himself," said Sergeant Fowler grimly. "Looks like someone wanted him dead." That night, the village of Marlecombe did not sleep. At the Hare and Hound, the local inn, the whispers began. Some said it was a burglary gone wrong. Others swore they'd seen a stranger lurking near the green that afternoon. Mrs. Pennington insisted she'd heard quarrelling at the Harcourts the day before. And by morning, the rumours had grown like ivy, creeping into every home, twisting into new shapes with every retelling. Miss Marple sat quietly through breakfast, her hands folded neatly around her cup of tea. She listened, as she always did, not to what was said, but to how it was said. She had known men like Mr. Harcourt. Charming to some, insufferable to others. A man whose smile often hid more than it revealed. And as she watched the light glint through the windowpane, the very same kind of pain that had borne that dreadful mark, she thought, with quiet certainty, that this murder would not be easily explained. No. Someone in Marlecombe had pressed that hand to the glass, and Miss Marple intended to find out who. Chapter 2. Gossip at the Green. By the next morning, Marlecombe was humming with that curious energy which only tragedy can awaken in a quiet village. The mist had barely lifted from the green when doors began to open, curtains twitched, and voices carried over the hedges like birdsong. The death of Mr. Leonard Harcourt, a man of wealth and reputation, was not a thing to be digested quietly. He had been, in the polite words of Mrs. Weatherby, a most respected gentleman, though others, in less polite moments, might have called him a rather difficult man to like. At the Hare and Hound, the village's only inn, a small crowd had already gathered. Mrs. Pennington, who ran the post office, was holding court beside the fireplace, relaying her version of events to anyone who would listen. "He was found in the drawing-room, I'm told," she said, lowering her voice for effect. "Cup of tea beside him, and that dreadful handprint on the window. Mark my words, it wasn't no burglar. There's more to it than that." Old Mr. Trask nodded vigorously. "Aye, and they say the window was locked from the inside. How'd you suppose that happened, eh? Ghosts, maybe." This suggestion was met with scandalized laughter, but the speculation rolled on. Servants, visitors, quarrels over money, jealous wives, mysterious strangers. Marlecombe was alive with theories, each one more dramatic than the last. Meanwhile, Miss Marple sat quietly at her table near the window, a cup of weak tea before her, pretending to read a newspaper that had been left behind. Her eyes, however, were not on the print. They were on the people. She noticed how Mrs. Pennington's hands trembled slightly as she spoke, betraying excitement rather than fear. How Dr. Redmond, just coming in for his morning coffee, kept glancing toward the door, as though dreading a summons from the police. And how young Margaret Finch, the vicar's daughter, slipped in silently, looking pale and strained. She said nothing to anyone, merely sat down, ordered tea, and stared at the table. "Poor child," murmured Miss Marple to herself. "She's seen something, I expect." Her intuition was seldom wrong. That afternoon, Sergeant Fowler paid a visit to Mrs. Weatherby's cottage, where Miss Marple was staying. He was red-faced and flustered, hat in hand. "Just thought I'd check in, he said, since you and Mrs. Weatherby were among the first on the scene." Mrs. Weatherby fluttered about offering tea, but Miss Marple merely nodded politely. "A very sensible thing to do, Sergeant. I dare say the village has been lively this morning." Fowler sighed. "You've no idea. Everyone's got a story to tell. But none of it adds up to much. Housekeeper says she heard a noise about 8 o'clock, but no one saw anyone enter or leave. And the back door was locked." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "And the handprint on the window." "That's the odd bit," Fowler admitted. "Clear as day, pressed on the inside of the glass, but no smudge, no sign of a struggle. As if someone simply leaned there for a moment." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "Or," she said gently, "as if someone wanted us to believe they had." The sergeant frowned, puzzled. "Beg pardon." But Miss Marple merely smiled. "Nothing at all, Sergeant. Do go on." Later that evening, after Fowler had gone, Mrs. Weatherby sighed. "You think there's something strange about that handprint, don't you, Jane?" Miss Marple looked up from her knitting, eyes thoughtful. "My dear, there is always something strange about the details people overlook. In this case, a hand pressed to glass. I find it rather deliberate." Outside, the wind stirred the budding branches, and a church bell chimed 6. Somewhere beyond the green, a dog barked, sharp, sudden, anxious. Miss Marple rose and went to the window. Across the lane, lights glowed in the windows of Harcourt House. The police were still there. And in that glow, she thought for an instant she saw a shadow move past the very window where the handprint had been found. The glass caught the last light of dusk, cold, gleaming, watchful. And Miss Marple, who had seen too many such gleams before, whispered softly to herself, "Someone is lying, and the truth is looking right through the window." Chapter 3. The Housekeeper's Secret. The morning mist still clung to the hedgerows when Miss Marple made her way up the gravel path to Harcourt House. It was a stately building, tall, symmetrical, and a little too proud of itself, as if aware that it had seen finer centuries. The gravel crunched beneath her sensible shoes, and a rook called from the elms above. The constable on duty at the gate knew Miss Marple by sight. Everyone in Marlecone did, and though he looked uncertain about letting her in, she gave such a kind smile and spoke in such a reasonable tone that he could hardly refuse. "Just a word or two with Mrs. Godfrey, the housekeeper," she said. "I've brought some scones. Poor woman's had a shock, I dare say." Inside, Harcourt House smelled faintly of lavender polish and yesterday's tragedy. The drawing-room where Mr. Harcourt had been found was still sealed off with a strip of police ribbon. The light through the tall windows fell coldly on the carpet. Miss Marple paused at the threshold. There, half concealed by the curtain's edge, was the windowpane, its lower corner still showing the faint smudge of that infamous handprint. It looked oddly small for a man's hand. Mrs. Godfrey, the housekeeper, met her in the morning room. She was a tall, angular woman, all in black, with sharp features that seemed carved from bone. Her hands, clasped tightly, betrayed a tremor. "Such a dreadful business, Miss Marple," she said at once. "I can't hardly believe it. I served Mr. Harcourt for 12 years. 12 years. And now this." Miss Marple handed her the basket. "You must try to eat something, my dear. You'll make yourself ill." Mrs. Godfrey sat stiffly, the teacup rattling slightly against its saucer. "The police were here all night, asking their questions. I told them all I knew. He was in the drawing-room after dinner, said he was expecting a visitor, though I never saw anyone come in." Expecting a visitor. Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Did he say who?" No, but he was agitated. More than I'd ever seen him. He sent Mr. Larkin, that's the gardener, home early and told me not to disturb him. I thought it strange, but Mr. Harcourt wasn't a man you questioned. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And what about Mrs. Harcourt? Mrs. Godfrey hesitated. She's away in Bath, visiting her sister. The police wired her last night. Poor lady will be beside herself. There was a silence, broken only by the faint ticking of a mantel clock. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the hearth, where she noticed a small, folded piece of paper half hidden behind the coal scuttle. May I? She asked. Mrs. Godfrey blinked. Of course. It was a torn page from a notebook, smudged but still legible. On it were written only a few words. 7:45, the window. Don't forget. Miss Marple folded it neatly and handed it to Mrs. Godfrey. Perhaps you should give this to Sergeant Fowler, she said mildly. But her mind was already racing. 7:45. That would have been just before the scream was heard. And the window. As she prepared to leave, she turned once more toward the drawing-room door. Through the crack, she could just make out the gleam of glass. A handprint. A note about a window. A visitor expected but never seen. Before she stepped out into the morning light, Mrs. Godfrey spoke again, low, hurried, and almost fearful. Miss Marple, she said, twisting her hands together, I didn't tell the police everything. Miss Marple turned back, gently. No. There was something else, Mrs. Godfrey whispered. A sound, just before I heard the scream. A sharp crack like glass breaking, but when they searched the room, nothing was broken. Not a thing. Miss Marple's eyes softened, though a glimmer of understanding passed behind them. My dear Mrs. Godfrey, she said quietly, sometimes it's not what is broken that. Chapter 4. The Visitor Who Never Came. The next morning dawned grey and wet. Rain had turned the cobblestones of Marlacombe High Street slick and shining, reflecting the windows of the post office and the church spire beyond. But even the dreary weather couldn't wash away the undercurrent of curiosity that hummed through the village. By 8:30, everyone had heard of the note. The whisper moved faster than the rain itself, a message about the window, a mysterious visitor, and a time just before the murder. At Mrs. Pennington's post office, the gossip reached a fever pitch. If you ask me, said Mrs. Pennington, stamping envelopes with exaggerated importance, that visitor was no friend at all. You don't write secret notes to decent company. Perhaps it was a woman, said Mrs. Alder from the bakery. Men never tell the whole truth where women are concerned. From her corner near the biscuit tins, Miss Marple listened quietly, pretending to be absorbed in the latest issue of the Church Gazette. She had already sent a note to Sergeant Fowler, asking if he might kindly return the torn paper after the police were done with it. For now, she had another plan, one that involved Margaret Finch, the vicar's daughter. Margaret arrived just as Miss Marple was leaving. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her gloved hands fidgeting with the strap of her handbag. Good morning, my dear, said Miss Marple gently. You look pale. I do hope you've had something to eat. Margaret managed a faint smile. I'm quite all right, Miss Marple. Only, I can't stop thinking about it. I heard it, you know. The scream. Margaret nodded. I was cycling home from the vicarage. I saw the light in Mr. Harcourt's window. It flickered for a moment, then went dark. I thought nothing of it, until the scream came. I looked back and, well, I thought I saw someone running down the side path. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her eyes sharpened slightly. Someone. Could you tell who? It was dark, Margaret said quickly. I only saw the shape, tall, wearing a long coat. Could have been a man, but I'm not entirely sure. Miss Marple thanked her kindly and asked no more. She knew better than to press a frightened girl. Instead, she walked the short distance to Harcourt House, stopping to examine the narrow path beside the garden wall. The rain had left it muddy, soft enough to catch impressions, but now only the faintest trace remained, half washed away. Still, she noticed one detail, the edge of a heel print, smaller than a man's but too broad for a lady's walking shoe. She took out her little notebook, made a quick sketch, and went on toward the church, her umbrella tapping lightly against the stones. That afternoon, Miss Marple found Sergeant Fowler at his desk in the small police office near the green. He looked weary, The kind of weariness that comes from too many reports and not enough answers. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, brightening slightly. "Got your note. You wanted to see the message we found. If it's not too inconvenient." He handed her the torn page, now sealed in a clear sleeve. She studied it carefully, the slant of the writing, the spacing of the words. 7:45, the window. Don't forget. It was written in ink, but with a light, somewhat uncertain hand. Not the bold scrawl of a man used to issuing orders. No, this writing had a nervous energy, as though the writer feared being seen. "Do you know who wrote it?" Miss Marple asked. Fowler shook his head. "No fingerprints. Not on the paper, nor the desk where it was found. And Mrs. Godfrey swears she never saw that note before." Miss Marple returned it carefully. "You might look into who had cause to meet Mr. Harcourt privately. I understand he had some business dealings with a Mr. Latham, something about property, wasn't it?" Fowler's brows lifted. "How did you know that?" "Oh," said Miss Marple mildly, "Mrs. Weatherby mentioned she saw them quarrelling near the grocer's some weeks ago. Mr. Latham is not the sort of man to forget an argument, I think." She rose, thanked him, and made her way back toward the lane, where a sudden movement at the far corner caught her eye. It was Mr. Latham himself, stepping hurriedly into his motor car. He looked around once, saw Miss Marple watching him, and immediately started the engine. For a man with nothing to hide, he drove away rather fast. Miss Marple stood quietly under her umbrella, the rain whispering around her, and murmured, "Visitors who never arrive are often more dangerous than those who do." And in the darkened window of Harcourt House behind her, the faint handprint, though now blurred by rain, still glimmered in the light, like a secret refusing to fade. Matters, but when it broke. And with that curious remark, she thanked the housekeeper and made her way down the path, her shawl fluttering in the wind. From the upper window of Harcourt House, unseen by anyone below, a curtain stirred ever so slightly, as if someone inside was watching her go. Chapter 5. The Man in the Long Coat. The following morning brought a timid sun, breaking through the damp mist that hung over Marlacombe. The church bells chimed 9, soft and steady, as Miss Marple walked toward the market square, a basket on her arm and her mind turning over what she knew and what she did not. A dead man. A mysterious note about the window. A missing visitor. And a witness, young Margaret Finch, who had seen a shadow running away in the dark. It was the shadow that troubled Miss Marple most. Because shadows, she knew, were rarely what they seemed. She paused outside Pritchard's butcher shop, pretending to examine the display, when she saw him, Mr. Latham, crossing the square in his usual brisk, self-important way. He was a man of 50 or so, with a ruddy complexion, thick moustache, and an air of prosperity that seemed to come more from confidence than honesty. Miss Marple adjusted her hat and moved toward him. "Good morning, Mr. Latham," she said, with her gentle smile. He stopped, startled. "Ah, Miss Marple, isn't it? Terrible business. What happened to poor Harcourt?" "Yes, dreadful," she agreed softly. "Such a shock to the village. I understand you and Mr. Harcourt were acquainted." He hesitated a fraction too long. "Business acquaintances, that's all. We had a small property matter between us, nothing important." Miss Marple tilted her head, as though in sympathy. "Ah, yes. These small matters can sometimes become unpleasant. I remember a case in St. Mary Mead, nothing criminal, of course, but people do let their tempers run away with them when money's involved." Latham gave a short laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, well, Harcourt and I sorted it. I hadn't seen him in weeks." "Really?" she asked innocently. "That's strange. Someone mentioned you were expected at his house the evening he died." For an instant, she saw it, the flicker of alarm beneath the mask. He recovered quickly, forcing a smile. "Nonsense. Pure gossip. You know how people talk." "Oh, indeed I do," said Miss Marple mildly. "And gossip, I've found, often begins with a small truth, like a spark that catches in dry grass." He looked uneasy, muttered something about being late, and walked off, his shoes clacking hard against the cobbles. Miss Marple watched him go, eyes narrowing ever so slightly. The long coat he wore, dark brown, heavy wool, matched precisely what Margaret Finch had described. She turned toward the Hare and Hound, where she knew Sergeant Fowler often took his mid-morning tea. He was there, exactly as she expected, looking harassed over a pile of papers. "Good day, Sergeant," she said cheerfully. "I've just spoken with Mr. Latham." Fowler sighed. "Oh, that one. We've had an eye on him. Harcourt owed him money, quite a bit, apparently. But he's got an alibi. Says he was in reading that evening. His clerk confirms it." Miss Marple sat down across from him. "His clerk, you say?" The nervous young man with the spectacles. Fowler nodded. "That's him. Alfred Nunn." She smiled faintly. "I wonder if poor Mr. Nunn would find it easy to contradict his employer. I dare say he's rather dependent on Mr. Latham's good opinion." Fowler frowned. "You think Latham's lying?" "I think," Miss Marple replied calmly, "that truth often hides in what people insist most strongly." Later that afternoon, she stopped by the churchyard. The rain had left the ground soft, and near the side gate she noticed something curious, a set of footprints leading toward the Harcourt property. They were faint now, but distinct enough, the same heel shape she'd seen near the garden path. And judging by the length of stride, they belonged to a man of Mr. Latham's height. She knelt briefly, pressing her gloved hand to the earth, comparing the print to her note. A perfect match. Then, just as she was straightening, a voice spoke behind her. "Looking for something, Miss Marple?" She turned. It was Margaret Finch, standing beneath a yew tree, clutching her shawl. "Oh, my dear, you startled me." Only admiring the way the ground holds memory. Even after a storm, one can still see what's been and gone. Margaret nodded, pale. "I've remembered something else. That night, when I saw the figure running, I think he dropped something. Near the lane. I didn't want to go back in the dark, but this morning I looked." She opened her hand. In her palm lay a small, broken cufflink, engraved with the initials LL. Miss Marple took it carefully, her eyes thoughtful. "How curious," she murmured. "A clue that seems to point too neatly to one man always makes me suspect another." The church bell tolled, echoing through the mist, and Miss Marple looked toward the distant silhouette of Harcourt House, the cold window glinting once more in the fading light. The handprint might have been half wiped away, but the truth, she felt, was beginning to emerge, piece by delicate piece. Chapter 6. The Alibi Cracks. 2 days after the murder, Marlecombe was trying, rather unsuccessfully, to return to normal. The postman made his rounds, the grocer stacked his shelves, and Mrs. Pennington still found time to gossip between customers. Yet beneath the surface hum of daily life lay a tremor, the uncomfortable sense that someone in their midst knew more than they should. Miss Marple, however, seemed perfectly at ease. She was seated by Mrs. Weatherby's fireplace, knitting a pale blue scarf, when Sergeant Fowler knocked at the door. He looked weary and slightly flustered, as men often did when they came to Miss Marple for help but didn't want to admit it. "Morning, Miss Marple. Thought you'd like to know, we've confirmed Mr. Latham's alibi. He was seen in reading that night, dining at the King's Arms. Signed the hotel register himself." "How very thorough of him," said Miss Marple softly, without looking up from her needles. Fowler frowned. "You sound doubtful." "Oh, not doubtful, Sergeant. Merely intrigued. Men who make a point of proving where they were are often trying to draw attention away from where they weren't." He blinked. "Come again." She smiled, folding her knitting neatly on her lap. "Tell me, was the register written in his usual hand?" Fowler rubbed his chin. "Didn't think to compare it." "Perhaps you should. Forgery can be a very useful thing when one wishes to be in two places at once." Fowler stared, half in admiration, half in confusion. "You've a mind like a corkscrew, Miss Marple." "Just experience, my dear Sergeant," she said modestly. "In small villages, one learns how people behave when they wish to deceive, which is rather similar everywhere, from Marlecombe to St. Mary Mead." After he left, Miss Marple sat for a moment in silence, her eyes fixed on the fire. Then she rose, put on her shawl, and went to call on Mr. Nunn, Mr. Latham's young clerk. Mr. Alfred Nunn lived in a neat little cottage by the railway crossing. He was a timid, slight man, with hair that never quite stayed in place and spectacles that kept slipping down his nose. He looked startled when Miss Marple appeared at his gate. "Good afternoon, Mr. Nunn. I do hope I'm not intruding. I just wanted a word about your employer, Mr. Latham." He blinked nervously. "Mr. Latham? Oh, yes, of course. Terrible business about Mr. Harcourt, isn't it? Indeed. You must have been quite distressed. The sergeant tells me you confirmed Mr. Latham's trip to Reading. Yes, he left that afternoon. I was in the office until late. He telephoned me from his hotel around 8 o'clock, I think. Ah, Miss Marple said gently. And you recognized his voice, of course. Mr. Nunn hesitated. Well, it was a bad connection. But yes, I believe so. Her tone remained kindly, conversational, yet her eyes never wavered. Did you, by any chance, see him write in the register at the King's Arms? Oh, no, I wasn't there myself. She smiled. Of course not. But perhaps you helped him with a few letters before he left? You're quite familiar with his handwriting, then? Yes, very, he said, straightening slightly, eager to be helpful. Miss Marple nodded. That's splendid. Then you'd notice if something he wrote seemed a little unlike him. Mr. Nunn's face changed. The words were mild, but something in her tone made him uneasy. His hands twisted together. Well, now that you mention it, the L in his name looked strange, somehow. Longer than usual. But perhaps I'm imagining it. Perhaps, said Miss Marple, rising. Thank you, Mr. Nunn. You've been most kind. As she walked back along the lane, she allowed herself the faintest of smiles. The LL cufflink, the note about the window, the oddly written hotel signature, all pieces of a puzzle that fit together too neatly. And when things fit too neatly, Miss Marple knew someone was guiding the hand. That evening, Sergeant Fowler came by again, visibly agitated. You were right, Miss Marple. We checked the register, and the signature's off. Different ink, slightly different hand. Hotel clerk doesn't recall seeing Latham until the following morning. Miss Marple nodded slowly. So he could have been here, after all. Fowler blew out a breath. And there's more. The cufflink we found, Latham claims it was stolen from his study weeks ago. Convenient, isn't it? Murmured Miss Marple. Almost as if someone wanted us to believe it belonged to him. Fowler leaned forward. Then who planted it? Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the window, where the evening light was fading. That, Sergeant, depends on who knew he would be blamed. And I think I know just the sort of person who would profit from that. Outside, the church bell tolled again, slow, solemn, unchanging, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of a window shutter creaked in the wind. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, hearing it. The handprint on the window, she whispered, was not left by guilt, but by fear.
Chapter 7. The Lady in Bath. The return of Mrs. Eleanor Harcourt to Marlecombe was the kind of event that could halt gossip mid-sentence. Even Mrs. Pennington, who prided herself on hearing everything before anyone else, admitted she hadn't expected the widow so soon. She arrived just after luncheon in a dark blue motorcar, dressed in morning black, her veil drawn and her bearing composed in that peculiarly English way that suggests composure purchased at great emotional cost. Miss Marple was in the vicarage garden when she saw the car pass along the lane. Ah, she murmured to the vicar's wife, who was cutting roses, now, my dear Mrs. Finch, we shall begin to learn what sort of man Mr. Harcourt truly was. Mrs. Finch looked startled. Oh, Jane, you think she knows something? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Wives often do. Whether they choose to tell it is another matter. That evening, Mrs. Harcourt received a few polite callers. Among them was Sergeant Fowler, who had come to deliver her husband's personal effects and offer condolences. She thanked him with dignified restraint, then requested a few days of privacy. Only one visitor was invited to take tea with her the next morning, Miss Marple. The drawing-room of Harcourt House had been tidied, the heavy draperies drawn back to let in the pale autumn light. The faint mark of the handprint still lingered on the windowpane, despite all efforts to polish it away. Mrs. Harcourt noticed Miss Marple's glance. They've scrubbed that glass half a dozen times, she said softly, and still the mark shows through. It's as if Leonard's spirit won't let go. Miss Marple took a careful sip of tea. Or perhaps, dear Mrs. Harcourt, something else clings to it, the truth, maybe. A shadow crossed the widow's face. You think it was murder, then? I think, Miss Marple replied, that accidents seldom leave notes behind reminding people not to forget windows. Mrs. Harcourt's hands trembled slightly on her cup. After a pause, she said, "There was something I didn't tell the police. Leonard received a letter 2 days before he died. It upset him terribly." "A letter?" "Yes. I never saw what was written, but I remember the envelope. It was pale green. He read it at breakfast, went quite white, and tore it into pieces. Later, I found one scrap he'd missed. I shouldn't have looked, but," she hesitated, color rising faintly in her cheeks. "It contained only 3 words, 'You promised me.'" Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her expression remained gentle. "And you don't know who sent it?" "No return address. Only initials EF." "EF," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "How curious." Mrs. Harcourt's gaze dropped to her lap. "I believe Leonard once knew a woman by that name, Evelyn Fenton. Long ago, before we were married. I thought nothing of it until now." Miss Marple's knitting needles, she had brought them, as always, clicked softly. "The past, my dear, has an uncomfortable habit of returning when least convenient." Mrs. Harcourt sighed. "If she came here that night." "She may not have," Miss Marple said quietly. "But someone wanted us to think she did." On her way back through the village, Miss Marple stopped by the post office. "Mrs. Pennington," she said pleasantly, "do you recall if a letter was sent to Mr. Harcourt earlier this week, pale green envelope, no return address?" Mrs. Pennington brightened immediately. Nothing delighted her more than being asked to recall the mail. "Indeed I do, Miss Marple. Posted from Bath on Tuesday afternoon. Neat handwriting, not local. I remember thinking it looked rather foreign, somehow looped YS and such. And the scent? Lavender water, quite strong." Miss Marple thanked her, leaving Mrs. Pennington thrilled at her own importance. She walked slowly back toward the green, turning the name Evelyn Fenton over in her mind. She had heard it once before, in a small remark years ago, at a garden party in St. Mary Mead. A woman who had been jilted, left with bitterness enough to last a lifetime. As the church clock struck 5, Miss Marple paused by the lane that led toward Harcourt House. The curtains were drawn now, but through a narrow gap she could see Mrs. Harcourt's silhouette at the window, still and watchful. "You promised me," Miss Marple murmured to herself. Such words are seldom written without purpose, or without pain. And as the evening light faded, she felt, rather than saw, that somewhere in Marlecombe another pair of eyes was watching her, just as intent, and far less kind.
Chapter 8. The Letter from Bath. The next morning dawned grey and restless, with a chill wind stirring the last of the summer leaves. Miss Marple, wrapped in her neat grey shawl, was at breakfast when the post arrived. Nothing of importance, save for a circular from a seed company and a note from her niece in London. Yet her mind was elsewhere, tracing a line on the map between Marlecombe and Bath. It was not in Miss Marple's habit to go gallivanting about the countryside. But when the threads of truth began to tangle, she often found that a small journey, and a pot of tea in a strange place, helped to set them right again. By noon, she was on the train. Bath, with its pale stone crescents and delicate air of faded gentility, looked much the same as it always had, beautiful, dignified, and faintly melancholic. Miss Marple alighted at the station and took a cab to a modest tea-room near Pulteney Street. The windows gleamed, and inside, the scent of scones and lavender soap mingled oddly together. The waitress, a chatty girl with fair curls and a Midlands accent, soon brought her tea. "You wouldn't happen to know of anyone by the name of Evelyn Fenton, would you?" Miss Marple asked mildly, after a few moments' small talk. The girl frowned, thinking. "Fenton? Can't say as I do, There's a Miss Fenton what comes in sometimes for tea, older lady, wears too much rouge. Lives near Sydney Gardens, I think." "Does she, indeed? How very kind of you, my dear." Miss Marple smiled a soft, grandmotherly smile, and left a generous tip. An hour later she was walking up a quiet street lined with fine Georgian houses, many now let in rooms. The brass plates on the doors read names like Dr. Ellison, consulting surgeon, and Mrs. Winthrop, rooms to let. She stopped before a smaller house with neat lace curtains and a faint smell of lavender from within. A maid answered the door, looking slightly suspicious until Miss Marple said gently, "I've come to see Miss Evelyn Fenton, if she's receiving." After a pause, the maid nodded. "I'll see if she's at home." Inside, the drawing room was prim and over-decorated, filled with photographs, lace doilies, and a piano long out of tune. Miss Fenton entered moments later, a tall woman in her late 50s, with sharply penciled brows and the unmistakable air of someone who had once been handsome and never quite stopped believing she still was. "I don't believe we've met," she said coolly. "No, I dare say not," Miss Marple replied with a pleasant smile. "My name is Marple. I come from Marlecombe, in Somerset." At that, Miss Fenton's expression flickered. Just a second, but enough. Marlecombe. I haven't heard that name in years. Then perhaps you once knew a gentleman there, Mr. Leonard Harcourt. The colour drained subtly from Miss Fenton's face. "Why do you ask?" Miss Marple took out her knitting from her bag and began calmly casting on a few stitches. "Because he died last week, I'm afraid. Under rather unhappy circumstances." Miss Fenton sat very still. "Dead? How?" "It was said to be an accident. But some of us in Marlecombe are not entirely sure." A tremor ran through Miss Fenton's hands. "I sent him a letter," she admitted at last. "I only wanted him to answer me, just a few words to explain himself. I had no idea he was dead." Miss Marple nodded, as though she'd expected this. "You wrote. You promised me." "Might I ask, what was the promise?" Miss Fenton gave a bitter little laugh. "That he would marry me. 30 years ago. We were engaged once, before he met Eleanor. Then, he disappeared. Left me with debts, with shame, with nothing but that wretched promise. I wrote after I saw his name mentioned in the Bath Gazette last month. I suppose I wanted to remind him I hadn't forgotten." She pressed a hand to her forehead. "I swear I meant no harm." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "I believe you. But someone else may have used your letter for quite a different purpose." Miss Fenton blinked. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple rose, her knitting neatly folded away. "I mean that your letter was never meant for his heart. It was meant for the police to find. Someone wanted that pale green envelope to point a finger at you, Miss Fenton. And they took great care to make sure it did." That evening, as the train rattled back toward Marlecombe, Miss Marple gazed out at the darkening fields. A puzzle was taking shape in her mind. If Miss Fenton had truly sent the letter, then it had passed through many hands before reaching Mr. Harcourt. Someone in Marlecombe had known of its arrival, had used it. The letter was not the cause of the murder, but the mask for it. And that someone, she thought grimly, had been very careful indeed. As the lights of Marlecombe appeared in the distance, Miss Marple made a small, decisive note in her little notebook. "Letter from Bath. Lavender scent. Used as decoy. Check, who saw it arrive? Also, who benefits most from Harcourt's death?" She snapped the notebook shut with a quiet sigh. The train whistled, the countryside rolled past, and Miss Marple, serene but unsmiling, began planning her next quiet conversation. Chapter 9. The Gardener's Secret. It was late afternoon when Miss Marple stepped off the train at Marlecombe Station. The autumn wind carried with it the faint scent of smoke and damp earth, that peculiar mixture that always made her think of endings, of summers gone and truths finally uncovered. She took the small path that led past the churchyard and down toward the green. The village looked much as it always did, peaceful, polite, and utterly unaware of its own secrets. Yet beneath that calm surface, Miss Marple sensed the quiet unrest of whispers growing bolder by the day. By the time she reached the vicarage, Mrs. Finch was already waiting for her with tea and scones. "Oh, Jane, you've been to Bath. Did you learn anything?" Miss Marple removed her gloves, smiling faintly. "Only that people rarely write letters without reason, and that those who read them sometimes misunderstand the reason entirely." Mrs. Finch blinked. "I'm not sure I follow." "That's all right, dear," said Miss Marple kindly. "Most people don't, until it's too late." The next morning, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to Harcourt House. The garden lay in its usual state of mild disorder, the sort of untidiness belonging to a home where grief had silenced small daily labours. The man trimming the rose bushes looked up as she approached. It was Arthur Bream, the Harcourt's gardener. A tall man in his 50s, with weathered hands and a guarded expression, he gave her a polite nod. "Morning, Miss Marple. You're wanting to see the mistress?" "Not just yet, thank you," she said mildly. "I thought I might admire your dahlias. They're doing wonderfully, considering the frost we've had." He hesitated, then smiled slightly. "Aye, they're tough things. Like folks, sometimes." Miss Marple bent to Inspector Bloom. "I always think a garden tells one a great deal about its keeper, Mr. Bream. Yours speaks of care and observation." The man gave her a sharp look, then busied himself with his shears. "Observation, is it? Aye, well, you see a thing or two working outdoors." "I dare say you do," Miss Marple said gently. "And perhaps you saw something the night Mr. Harcourt died." For a long moment, there was only the snip of the shears. Then Arthur Bream lowered them and wiped his hands on his apron. "I've told the police what I saw. Leastways, what I thought I saw." "And what did you think you saw, Mr. Bream?" He glanced toward the house. "It were late, 9:30, maybe. I'd gone down the side path to shut the greenhouse door. I heard a noise, like someone arguing, near the drawing-room window. Then a sort of crash, glass, maybe, and a woman's voice saying, 'It's too late now.' Clear as anything." Miss Marple's eyes flickered. "A woman's voice, you say?" "Aye, Not Mrs. Harcourt's, neither. I'd swear to that. Softer, higher. Then it went quiet, and a minute later I saw someone, a woman, running from the back gate toward the lane. She had a scarf over her head. Couldn't see her face." "Did you mention that to the police?" Bream nodded. "Told them straight. But they said I must have been mistaken, that it was likely the wind or summit. Didn't want to make trouble for the missus, I reckon." Miss Marple regarded him steadily. "And you, Mr. Bream, you didn't want to make trouble either, did you?" He hesitated, then looked away. "No, The mistress has been kind to me, and I reckon folks have suffered enough without me stirring the pot." Miss Marple gave him a small, approving nod. "Kindness is a fine thing, Mr. Bream, though truth, alas, is sometimes kinder in the end." She left him standing among the roses, his face troubled, his hands still clutching the shears. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat before her fire, turning the matter over in her mind. A woman's voice. A quarrel. The sound of glass. And the handprint, left upon the windowpane, as if in desperation or fear. "It's too late now." Those words echoed in her thoughts. They did not sound like guilt. They sounded like warning. That evening, Miss Marple paid a visit to Inspector Graves, the man in charge of the investigation. He greeted her with a weary smile. "Evening, Miss Marple. Don't tell me you've found something again." She folded her hands neatly in her lap. "Nothing so dramatic, Inspector. Only that your gardener's story deserves another listen." Graves frowned. "Bream. We checked his statement. Said he couldn't be sure." "Oh, but he is sure," Miss Marple said mildly. "He merely needed someone to believe him." The inspector sighed. "And what does it prove, this mystery woman of his?" "That Mr. Harcourt's death was not the quiet domestic tragedy you suppose," Miss Marple replied softly. "And that whoever killed him, man or woman, was desperate enough to stage the scene, to leave a mark that would haunt the glass long after the deed was done." She stood, taking her coat. "If I were you, Inspector, I'd start looking not for strangers in Marlecombe, but for people who know how to look innocent." Later that night, as Miss Marple closed her curtains, she paused. Across the road, a light flickered in an upper window of Harcourt House, just once, then vanished. And though she could not see who was behind it, she felt, quite distinctly, that someone within those walls was beginning to feel afraid. Chapter 10. The Confession That Wasn't. For the next 2 days, Marlecombe lived in a quiet tremor of speculation. The inquest had been postponed. The coroner cited unsettled evidence. In every drawing-room and grocer shop, people whispered that perhaps poor Mr. Harcourt hadn't slipped and fallen after all. Miss Marple, meanwhile, went about her usual errands, attending to her knitting circle, calling upon Mrs. Finch for tea, and pausing, quite by chance, near Harcourt House every afternoon. She never appeared to watch anything. Yet she saw everything. It was on the third evening that the first crack appeared in the polite facade of grief. Mrs. Eleanor Harcourt sent for the vicar. She was waiting in the dimly lit drawing-room, her hands clasped tightly before her, when Reverend Finch arrived. Her face was pale and drawn. Her eyes had that strange brightness of someone who has not slept. "Reverend," she began, "I must speak before the Lord compels me further." I can't keep it inside. The vicar, alarmed but gentle, motioned for her to sit. My dear lady, whatever burden you carry, perhaps it is not as dark as you fear. She gave a small, trembling laugh. You are wrong, Mr. Finch. It is as dark as sin itself. And then, haltingly, she began her story. She said that on the night of her husband's death, they had quarrelled. He had accused her of hiding letters from him, letters from a woman in Bath. She had denied it at first, then admitted she had opened one out of jealousy. The argument had grown heated. He had struck her across the face. She had run to the window, desperate for air. He followed, furious. In her panic, she had pushed him away, and he had fallen. Down, through the open sash, into the darkness below. I didn't mean to kill him, she whispered. God knows I didn't. But I did. I did. And with that, she broke into shaking sobs. Reverend Finch, horrified and confused, did what any well-meaning clergyman would do. He told her to rest, and then went straight to Inspector Graves. Within the hour, the police were at Harcourt House. The newspapers would later call it the widow's confession. But when Miss Marple heard the news over breakfast, she merely said, How very neat. Much too neat. Mrs. Finch blinked. But Jane, she confessed. Surely that settles everything. Miss Marple looked down at her tea thoughtfully. My dear, a confession may settle consciences, but it does not always settle facts. That afternoon, she walked to the vicarage to speak privately with Reverend Finch. The poor man looked distraught. I don't understand it, Miss Marple, he said, wringing his hands. She seemed quite sincere. Broken, even. How could such grief be false? Oh, sincerity, my dear Reverend, is a most deceptive quality, Miss Marple said softly. It can spring from truth, or from love, guilt, fear, even protection. Protection. She nodded. Yes. Sometimes a person confesses not to save themselves, but to shield another. Reverend Finch looked astonished. But who could she be protecting? Miss Marple smiled faintly. That, my dear, is the question. That evening, while the village speculated and the police prepared to make their formal charge, Miss Marple sat quietly by her fire, her knitting lying idle in her lap. She thought of the woman's voice the gardener had heard. She thought of the letter from Bath, a decoy, perhaps. She thought of the handprint on the windowpane, left open in the cold night air, as though someone had pressed it there, not in panic, but in farewell. It's too late now, the voice had said. A curious phrase. Not angry, not terrified. Resigned. Miss Marple rose, lit her lamp, and took out a notebook. She wrote a single line. The truth never confesses itself. It must be coaxed, gently. She set her pen down, her mind already forming the next step. The next morning, she visited Inspector Graves again. Inspector, she said mildly, I do hope you've not arrested Mrs. Harcourt. Not yet, he grunted. We're giving her a night to recover. But her confession's solid. She told the whole story. Miss Marple regarded him with kind eyes. Did she, though? Or only the part someone wanted her to believe? Graves frowned. Now, what's that supposed to mean? It means, Miss Marple said quietly, that if you wish to find the truth, you might start with the person who benefits most from Mr. Harcourt's death. And I dare say it isn't his wife. She stood, adjusting her gloves. I should like to speak to the gardener again, if you don't mind. And perhaps to that charming young maid, Lucy, who seemed so nervous the other day. People who clean windows often see more than they're expected to. Graves gave a weary sigh. You think we've got it wrong again, Miss Marple. I think, my dear Inspector, she said, smiling sweetly, that Marlecombe is far too tidy a place for the truth to stay hidden long. That night, as the wind moaned softly through the hedges, Miss Marple sat by her window and watched Harcourt House, dark and still against the fading light. Somewhere within those walls, she thought, someone was waiting. Not for justice, but for the wrong person to hang in their stead. And she would not let that happen. Chapter 11. The Maid by the Window. The following morning broke damp and grey, the kind of morning that seemed to press the air flat over Marlecombe. Mist lingered along the hedgerows and the chimneys smoked half-heartedly. It was not a morning for revelations, yet Miss Marple knew, as surely as she knew when to turn a cake in the oven, that Truth often preferred dull weather. She set out early, shawl pinned, umbrella in hand, and walked the short lane to Harcourt House. The gate creaked softly as she entered the garden. The roses drooped, their petals heavy with dew. She paused, noticing how the ground near the side path bore faint traces of footsteps, smaller than a man's, but not so small as a child's. At the back door, she found Lucy, the young maid, hanging laundry on a line. Lucy started when she saw her. "Oh, Miss Marple. You gave me such a fright." "My dear, I'm terribly sorry," said Miss Marple with her kindest smile. "I was hoping for a word, if you've a few minutes." Lucy hesitated, glancing toward the house. "Mrs. Harcourt's resting, I suppose I could spare a moment." "Good. I do so enjoy speaking with sensible young women. It's becoming rarer than it ought to be." Lucy blushed faintly and motioned for Miss Marple to follow her to the small kitchen scullery. The kettle was already boiling. "Now," Miss Marple began, lowering herself onto a chair, "I hear you've had a rather difficult week." Lucy's hands fidgeted with her apron. "Oh, it's been awful, I keep thinking I'll wake up and find it never happened." "Quite understandable," said Miss Marple kindly. "You were fond of Mr. Harcourt." Lucy nodded. "He was strict, but never unkind. He always said I reminded him of someone." "How interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "Did he ever say who?" "No, only that she was gone." Miss Marple's needles clicked once. She had brought her knitting, of course. "Tell me, Lucy, on the night of the accident, were you in the house?" Lucy swallowed. "Yes, I'd gone to close the shutters in the drawing room. Mrs. Harcourt and Mr. Harcourt were arguing. I didn't mean to overhear, truly, but—" "But you did," Miss Marple finished gently. "And what did you hear?" Lucy hesitated, twisting the edge of her apron. "He said something about a letter. He was angry, said she'd betrayed him. Mrs. Harcourt was crying. Then he told her, 'You'll regret it before the night's through.' She ran out of the room." "And you?" "I stayed behind to tidy up. The window was open. I saw him standing there, looking out. Then someone came up behind him, but it wasn't Mrs. Harcourt." Miss Marple's voice was soft but steady. "Who was it, Lucy?" The girl's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know her name, She wore a scarf, and she looked frightened. I thought she was a visitor. They spoke too low for me to hear. Then he shouted, and she pushed him, or maybe he slipped, I don't know. There was glass everywhere and—" Lucy stopped, her voice breaking. Miss Marple reached across and patted her hand. "You did very well to tell me, my dear. Very well indeed." "But the police said it must have been Mrs. Harcourt." "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "People often find comfort in the simplest explanation. Unfortunately, the simplest is seldom the truest." Later that day, Miss Marple stood again before the drawing-room window. The faint outline of the handprint still shimmered under the light. She leaned close, her sharp old eyes following the shape of it. It was small, smaller than Mrs. Harcourt's, certainly, and the fingers long, fine, feminine. She pressed her own hand beside it, comparing size. "A young woman's hand," she murmured, "not a widow's." She turned and saw Arthur Bream watching her from the garden path. "Funny thing about that mark," he said gruffly. "No matter what polish I use, it won't come off." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, straightening, "because it was never meant to. Some marks wish to be remembered." Bream frowned. "You think the killer left it on purpose?" Miss Marple gave a small, secret smile. "Oh no, Mr. Bream. I think the innocent did." That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire once again, her knitting forgotten in her lap. Her mind whirled quietly. A woman in a scarf. A frightened voice. A hand pressed to the glass, not in guilt, but in grief. "It's too late now." The words echoed again. She thought of the letter, scented with lavender. Of Evelyn Fenton, bitter but truthful. Of the young maid, trembling as she spoke. A theory was forming, delicate, dangerous, and almost complete. Miss Marple took out her little notebook and wrote, "The wrong woman confessed. The right one tried to save him." But who wanted him dead, and why use her handprint? She tapped her pencil against her chin, then smiled faintly. Because, she whispered, it wasn't just murder. It was revenge dressed as tragedy. Chapter 12. The Lavender Clue. The next morning dawned brighter, though the chill of suspicion still hung in the air around Marlacombe like fog that refused to lift. The gossip in the bakery had reached fever pitch. Mrs. Harcourt's name was on everyone's tongue, and Miss Marple, buying her usual half-pound of seed cake, listened with polite detachment. "They say she'll be charged before week's end," murmured Mrs. Dodd, the baker's wife. "And about time, too. The man's no longer cold, and she's still pretending innocence." Miss Marple's smile was gentle but distant. "I always think," she said mildly, "that pretending and being are not so very far apart in some people's eyes." By the time she reached her little cottage, her mind was already set. She poured herself tea, opened her notebook, and wrote one word at the top of the page. Lavender. It had haunted her since her visit to Harcourt House. The faint but unmistakable scent that lingered near the window curtain, long after the room had been aired and scrubbed. Miss Marple had a remarkable memory for fragrances, the result of decades spent keeping linen drawers fresh with herbs and flowers. This particular lavender was not common. It had a sharper note, more French than English. And there was only one woman in Marlacombe who imported her perfume from Paris. That afternoon, she called upon Mrs. Fenton. Evelyn Fenton lived alone in a tall, narrow house overlooking the churchyard. Her drawing-room was immaculate, lace doilies, polished brass, and the faintest trace of that same lavender. "Miss Marple," she said coolly, offering a seat. "I suppose you've come to talk about the Harcourt affair. Everyone does." "I confess," Miss Marple said, lowering herself onto the sofa, "that I am rather troubled by it. I should like to understand, if I can, how a respectable man comes to fall through his own window, and how another woman's perfume came to linger there." Mrs. Fenton's eyes flashed. "Perfume?" "Yes. Lavender. Quite distinctive. I noticed it when I called yesterday." Mrs. Fenton gave a thin smile. "Perhaps Mrs. Harcourt used the same." "Oh, but she did not," Miss Marple replied lightly. "She prefers violets. It was the one thing her husband could not abide." A silence fell, long, heavy, dangerous. Mrs. Fenton turned toward the window, her hands clasping tightly. "You have a sharp nose, Miss Marple." "I do," said Miss Marple softly. "And I remember what you told me last week, that you knew how to make a man pay for deceit." Mrs. Fenton rose abruptly. "I was angry." Words said in jest. "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured, knitting calmly. "But anger has a way of outlasting jest. I dare say Mr. Harcourt wronged you once." The woman turned, her face pale but defiant. "He promised marriage. After his wife's illness. But she recovered. And I was made a fool." Miss Marple nodded, not unkindly. "So you went to see him that night?" Evelyn's lip trembled. "He called me. Said he'd explain everything, that I must come quickly, before his wife returned." "And did he?" "I don't know. He said terrible things. That I was a convenience. That I'd imagined it all. I struck him, I don't remember how hard, and he stumbled back into the glass." There was silence then. Only the faint tick of the clock filled the room. Miss Marple looked at her steadily. "And the handprint?" I tried to pull him up. But he was already." She pressed her trembling hand to her face. "When I saw the blood, I ran. I didn't mean to leave her to take the blame, but I—" Miss Marple rose quietly. "My dear, I believe you." Evelyn's eyes widened. "You do?" "Yes. You didn't mean to kill him. But fear makes the innocent behave like the guilty. And guilt," she smiled faintly, "has a very particular perfume." Later that evening, Inspector Graves found Miss Marple waiting for him by the gate of Harcourt House. "You've been busy again, Miss Marple," he sighed. "What have you got for me this time?" "Only a scent, Inspector, but it leads straight to the truth." And she told him of the lavender, the quarrel, and the frightened woman's hand pressed to the window. When she finished, the inspector nodded slowly. "It fits. The maid's story, the mark, the timeline, everything." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Except one thing." "What's that?" She glanced up at the window, where the fading light caught the glass. The letter he wrote that night. It's missing. And that, Inspector, may tell us who really planned his death. Chapter 13. The Missing Letter. The next morning broke grey and thin, as if the sky itself were weary of deception. A pale drizzle had settled over Marlecombe, softening the sharp edges of gossip but not silencing them. At the post office, Mrs. Pennington was recounting the latest developments to anyone who'd listen. How Miss Marple had gone to see that fancy perfume woman up near the churchyard, and how the inspector had been seen calling at the same house not an hour later. By midday, everyone knew Evelyn Fenton had confessed, but as Miss Marple sat in her parlour, the news did not comfort her. She had been right before, many times in her life, but this time the pieces fitted too neatly, too quickly. She stirred her tea slowly. A frightened woman, a dead man, a shattered window. Yes, it all made sense. And yet, there was the matter of the letter. Inspector Graves arrived at 2:30, hat dripping rain, coat smelling faintly of damp wool and tobacco. Afternoon, Miss Marple. You'll be pleased to hear Mrs. Fenton's admitted the whole business. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. I should be, yes. Only I'm not. Graves raised an eyebrow. Not. She struck him, yes, but she did not plan to kill him. And someone did plan it, Inspector. He frowned, taking a seat by the hearth. You think there's more to it? I'm quite sure. The letter Mr. Harcourt was writing that night, to whom was it addressed? We don't know. His study desk was empty. Not a sheet, not an envelope. Exactly. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. That's rather remarkable, don't you think? A man halfway through a letter, interrupted, perhaps killed, and yet the page disappears completely. Someone removed it. Graves sighed. And who would that be, Miss Marple? Mrs. Fenton fled. Mrs. Harcourt wasn't home until morning. Miss Marple looked into the fire, the orange light flickering across her delicate features. No, but there was someone else in that house that evening. Someone quite overlooked, because she was supposed to be invisible. Graves blinked. The maid. Precisely. Miss Marple paid Clara, the maid, a visit later that afternoon. The girl's eyes were red and swollen. She had clearly been crying. Oh, Miss Marple, she sobbed, wringing her apron. It's all such a mess. I never meant to keep anything back. My dear, Miss Marple said kindly, sometimes people hold things back out of fear, not malice. Tell me, what did you see that night? The girl hesitated, then whispered, I heard voices in the study, Mr. Harcourt and that other lady, the one with the perfume. I didn't mean to listen, but they were shouting. Then I heard a crash and silence. I ran to the door, and he was lying there. I thought he'd just fainted. The lady ran out crying, so I went to fetch help. But when I came back, the letter on his desk was gone. Miss Marple leaned forward. You're quite sure it was there before? Oh yes, He'd been writing it all evening. I remember because he asked me to bring him a clean blotter. He said the ink kept smudging. Did you see what was written on it? The maid hesitated. Only a few words, at the top, My dearest E. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her heart quickened. Thank you, my dear, she said softly. You've been most helpful. That night, as the church clock struck 10, Miss Marple sat in her parlour, thinking. My dearest E. Everyone had assumed the letter was to Evelyn Fenton. But perhaps it wasn't. Perhaps E stood for someone else entirely. Her eyes drifted to the photograph that hung above her mantel, the Harcourts, taken 3 years ago at the summer fete. Mrs. Harcourt, serene and lovely, wearing a pale lilac dress. And beside her, another woman, laughing, arm linked with Leonard Harcourt's. Eleanor Finch, the vicar's wife. She remembered, now, the faint unease in Mrs. Finch's eyes the night of the murder. The trembling hands. The way she'd flinched when the inspector mentioned letters. Miss Marple folded her hands slowly. Oh, my dear Eleanor, she whispered. You've been very foolish indeed. The following morning, she called upon Mrs. Finch under the pretext of delivering a recipe for seed cake. The vicar's wife looked pale, tired, almost brittle. Jane, she said nervously, pouring tea, what brings you here so early? Oh, a little curiosity, Miss Marple said gently. I wondered if you might help me solve a riddle. Mrs. Finch tried to smile. I'm not sure I'm much good at riddles. This one is quite simple, Miss Marple said. If a man is writing a letter to a woman whose name begins with E, and that letter disappears after his death, who would most want to make sure it was never found? The cup in Mrs. Finch's hand rattled against the saucer. I don't understand. Oh, but you do, Miss Marple said softly. You see, I remember your husband once telling me that Leonard Harcourt had been very attentive to you once, before you were married. And I dare say old affection, even long buried, can still be stirred by loneliness. Mrs. Finch's composure cracked. He wrote to me, yes. He said he wished things had been different, that he'd made a mistake marrying Eleanor Harcourt. But I didn't mean for any of this. Miss Marple's gaze was kind but firm. I know, my dear. But someone else used that letter to destroy him, and nearly destroyed you with it. Outside, the rain had stopped. The air smelled of wet leaves and turned earth. Miss Marple walked home along the narrow lane, her mind working quietly, patiently, like clockwork. The puzzle was nearly solved now. Only one piece remained, the person who had found that letter first and used it as a weapon. And as she reached her garden gate, she knew who it must be. Oh yes, she whispered, gazing toward the distant outline of Harcourt House. It was you all along, wasn't it? Chapter 14. The Truth at Harcourt House. Marlacombe was unnaturally quiet the next morning. Even the sparrows on the church roof seemed subdued, as if the whole village were holding its breath. The case of Leonard Harcourt's death appeared settled to most. Evelyn Fenton's tearful confession had satisfied the police, and Mrs. Harcourt, pale and dignified, had retreated into mourning. But to Miss Marple, the air of finality was too tidy, too rehearsed. Real life, she often said, rarely ends with such neatness. That's the business of novels, not of human beings. And so, while Marlacombe went about its quiet routine, she prepared her trap. It began with a note. She wrote it in her delicate, old-fashioned hand, sealed it with a plain wafer, and delivered it herself to Harcourt House, where Mrs. Harcourt received it with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. My dear Mrs. Harcourt, I believe I have found something that belonged to your husband, a matter best discussed privately. Yours sincerely, Jane Marple. Asterisk. The widow's reply came within the hour. She would be delighted to receive Miss Marple that evening, after dusk. When Miss Marple arrived, the house was softly lit, one lamp in the hall, another in the drawing-room. Mrs. Harcourt wore black silk, and her hair, silvery gold, gleamed beneath the shaded light. How kind of you to come, Miss Marple, she said smoothly. You've been such a comfort through all this unpleasantness. Oh, not at all, my dear, Miss Marple said mildly, removing her gloves. I only wish to set a small matter right. She seated herself opposite the widow, her knitting bag resting neatly beside her chair. Leonard's things were returned to me yesterday, Mrs. Harcourt continued. I've scarcely the courage to go through them yet. So many memories. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. Quite understandable. Grief is a strange companion. It arrives uninvited, and lingers long after it's outstayed its welcome. Mrs. Harcourt smiled faintly. You do have a way with words, Miss Marple. Now, this matter you mentioned. Miss Marple leaned forward just enough for her voice to drop. It concerns a letter. The reaction was immediate, though subtle, the slightest tightening of Mrs. Harcourt's mouth, a flicker in her eyes. A letter, she repeated. Yes. One your husband was writing the night he died. The police, you see, could not find it. Which is curious, because I believe you did. The widow's smile faltered. I don't understand. Oh, but you do, Miss Marple said gently. Your maid saw him writing it. The words my dearest E were quite visible. Everyone assumed that meant Evelyn Fenton. But it didn't, did it? It meant Eleanor Finch, the vicar's wife. A harmless, foolish letter, nostalgic, but not improper. Still, when you found it, you saw betrayal where none existed. Mrs. Harcourt rose abruptly. This is nonsense. Is it? Miss Marple's tone remained calm. You went to his study after he dismissed the maid. You confronted him with the letter. There was a struggle, and then Evelyn arrived unexpectedly. Perhaps he had written to her earlier, perhaps not. But in the confusion, he fell. You realized what had happened, and what it looked like. The widow's breath came sharp. You think I killed him? I think, Miss Marple said softly, you let them believe someone else had. You wiped what you could, but not everything, that handprint on the windowpane, for instance. You told the maid to say nothing, and when Evelyn fled, you knew the police would find their culprit without your help. Mrs. Harcourt's eyes flashed. You have no proof. No, Miss Marple agreed. Only reason. And one other small thing. She opened her knitting bag and drew out a tiny glass vial. I found this behind your husband's desk. It contained ether. Very useful, I'm told, for numbing wounds, or for weakening a man before an accident. The silence that followed was long and brittle. Then, at last, Mrs. Harcourt sank back into her chair. You clever, meddling old woman, she whispered. He was going to leave me. For her. Do you know what that does to a woman, to be made a fool of, twice over? Miss Marple's gaze was kind but unyielding. I think I do, my dear. But murder does not restore dignity, it only steals peace. Tears slipped down Mrs. Harcourt's cheek. He slipped. I didn't mean to push. I only wanted to stop him, just to make him listen. Miss Marple rose slowly, gathering her things. I believe you, she said quietly. And I dare say the inspector will too. Intentions are rarely what condemn us, only the lies that follow. An hour later, Inspector Graves found Miss Marple waiting by the gate once more, the mist curling like smoke around her. It's over, she said simply. She admitted it. Yes. Not cold-blooded, only desperate. Graves exhaled deeply. You're remarkable, Miss Marple. The way you see through people. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes on the soft, shrouded windows of Harcourt House. People, my dear inspector, are quite transparent, if only one takes the time to look. That night, the rain returned, gentle, steady, washing the last traces of dust from the windowpane where a faint handprint had once lingered. And in the quiet heart of Marlecombe, life began to move again, slow, ordinary, and forever changed. Chapter 15. A Village Restored. It was remarkable, Miss Marple often thought, how swiftly peace could return to a village, or the appearance of it at least. Marlecombe, so recently thick with whispers and fear, seemed now to breathe again. The grocer's bell jangled cheerfully, the postmistress gossiped with renewed vigor, and the church bells rang once more for evensong. But beneath the surface calm, small ripples still stirred. People spoke of Mrs. Harcourt with cautious sympathy. Some said she'd gone quietly to her sister's home in Devon, others that she was under medical observation. No one spoke openly of prison, though everyone knew that Inspector Graves had taken her away under the gentlest of pretexts. Miss Marple, for her part, said very little. She had seen too many such endings, the tidy resolution, the polite avoidance, the tea poured over sorrow as though it could dissolve it. She spent her mornings tending the roses behind her cottage, and her afternoons at the vicarage, where Mrs. Finch had regained a little of her colour. The vicar, grateful and subdued, had called Miss Marple an angel in a bonnet, though she firmly declined the title. Angels, my dear Mr. Finch, have far less curiosity than I, she'd said, smiling. It was on a quiet Sunday afternoon, nearly a fortnight after the arrest, that Inspector Graves stopped by Miss Marple's cottage once more. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, hat in hand, boots respectfully wiped. Afternoon, Miss Marple. Good afternoon, Inspector. You'll find the kettle just coming to the boil. Sit down, you look as though you've been chasing scoundrels through the hedgerows. Graves chuckled and obeyed. No scoundrels today. Only paperwork. The coroner's report came in yesterday. Accidental death confirmed. They're recommending leniency. Miss Marple poured the tea, steady and calm. I am glad to hear it. Mrs. Harcourt is not wicked, only frightened and proud. That combination can make monsters of the best of us. He nodded, watching the steam curl from his cup. You've a way of seeing kindness in people, even after all they've done. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Not kindness, Inspector, only frailty. One must always allow for the weaknesses of the heart. After he had gone, she remained by the window for a long time, watching the rain begin again, soft, silvery threads that blurred the outlines of the garden. She thought of Leonard Harcourt, charming and careless, whose death had unspooled so many secrets. Of Evelyn Fenton, broken but alive. Of Eleanor Finch, whose conscience still trembled like glass in wind. And of Mrs. Harcourt, sitting somewhere alone, the weight of truth pressing heavier than any cell. Murder, Miss Marple murmured to herself, is seldom born of malice. More often, it's the child of pain and pride. The clock struck 4. She rose, fetched her knitting, and settled once more into her chair. The world, for all its sorrow, had a way of mending itself, one small stitch at a time. That evening, as dusk gathered, she stepped out to draw the curtains and paused a moment by the window. Across the lane, Harcourt House stood silent and shuttered, its garden overgrown, its windows reflecting only grey sky. But the glass that had once borne the print of a desperate hand was now clean, washed clear by the October rain. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "There are some stains," she said softly, "that only time can remove." Then she drew the curtain closed, the lamplight glowed warm behind her, and the little house on the edge of Marlacombe settled, once again, into peaceful quiet. Chapter 16. The Memory in the Garden. A week had passed since Inspector Graves' last visit, and Marlacombe had quietly turned its face back toward normal life. The baker's boy whistled again in the mornings, the vicar's bell chimed each evening, and the lanes smelled of damp leaves and chimney smoke. Yet for Miss Marple, there lingered a small thread of unrest, not of danger, but of memory. Something unfinished, as though the story, however neatly folded by the police and the coroner, still held one corner untucked. It was a fine morning when she decided to walk up to Harcourt House one last time. The autumn sun slanted through thinning branches, turning the hedgerows to fire. She took her umbrella, more out of habit than need, and made her way slowly along the familiar lane. The gate creaked softly as she opened it. The garden, once trimmed and proper, was running wild now, the flower beds choked with nettles, the roses gone leggy and thorned. Fallen leaves carpeted the gravel path like old letters left unread. Miss Marple's step was quiet, reverent. She had seen many houses like this, places where tragedy hung in the air long after the people had gone. By the terrace stood the window, the same window. Clean now, unbroken, reflecting only sky. For a long moment, she stood before it, hands folded lightly on the handle of her umbrella. "So much fuss," she murmured, "over a single pane of glass. And yet, how much it showed us." As she turned to leave, something caught her eye, a small patch of pale earth near the foot of the rose bushes. The ground had been disturbed, as if something had been buried recently. Curious, she stooped down, brushed aside a few damp leaves, and uncovered a small silver frame, tarnished and dirt-streaked. Inside, behind the cracked glass, was a photograph, Leonard Harcourt and his wife, smiling stiffly, taken perhaps a year before his death. For a long while, Miss Marple held it in her gloved hands. The image was water-stained, but one could still see the faint outline of Mrs. Harcourt's hand resting on her husband's arm. The same hand that, weeks ago, had pressed against a window in panic or guilt. She sighed, a sound not of judgment but of quiet sorrow. "Poor child," she whispered. Even her remorse was careful, tidy, as though she must hide her sorrow, even from the garden. Miss Marple reburied the frame gently, pressing the earth smooth once more. It seemed kinder that way, to let the ghosts of the Harcourts rest where they had quarrelled, loved, and lost. On her way back down the lane, she met Mrs. Finch, carrying a basket of apples from the rectory orchard. The younger woman smiled, though her eyes still carried a faint sadness. "Miss Marple, you've been up there again." "Yes, my dear. Just to see that all's quiet. And it is, very quiet." Mrs. Finch hesitated. "I still think of her, sometimes. Mrs. Harcourt. It could have been any of us, in her place." Miss Marple nodded gravely. "Indeed. That is what makes pity so necessary, and judgment so dangerous." When she reached home, the afternoon sun had turned the cottage windows to gold. She placed her umbrella by the door, hung her shawl, and sat down to her knitting once again. The fire crackled softly. Outside, a robin hopped along the wall, feathers fluffed against the chill. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles clicking in quiet rhythm. "Another story finished," she murmured. "And yet, the same lesson, always." She looked toward the window, where the garden beyond lay dappled in fading light. "People," she said softly, "will always believe they can hide their hearts. But a heart, once broken, leaves its print, just like a hand upon the glass." Chapter 17. The Winter Visitors. It was late November when the first removal van trundled up the lane toward Harcourt House. Miss Marple, from her window, saw it through a veil of rain, a squat grey vehicle, its engine panting like an old dog. She lowered her knitting and watched as men in caps carried furniture across the garden, their boots leaving dark tracks on the wet gravel. New people, she murmured. Already? The gossip, of course, had started before the van even arrived. Mrs. Finch had heard from the grocer that a retired colonel and his niece were moving in. Mr. Pottle at the post office swore it was an art dealer from London. And Mrs. Winchcombe, who always knew something others didn't, declared the house was being let by people with foreign ways. Miss Marple smiled at the rumours, all of them wrong and all of them true in their way. By the second afternoon, she saw for herself. The newcomers were indeed a colonel, Colonel Avery, tall and neat, his moustache as disciplined as his bearing, and his young niece, Miss Clara Avery, a pale, graceful girl with a distracted air and eyes that seemed to be searching for something unseen. They arrived with modest luggage, a canary in a gilt cage, and a small collection of framed sketches. The colonel carried himself like a man accustomed to command, but his niece seemed fragile, not sickly, but lost, as though she had left part of herself behind somewhere. That evening, the lamps at Harcourt House glowed again for the first time in months. The faint light through the fog made the old house appear almost alive, like a patient waking after a long illness. Miss Marple, sitting by her fire, could not help but feel a prickle of curiosity. It was not suspicion, not yet, but a gentle unease. Houses, she knew, did not forget easily. The next morning, she walked into the village for her errands and found the usual knot of conversation forming outside the greengrocer's. "Colonel Avery, you say?" asked Mrs. Finch, weighing a cabbage with unusual care. "Seems decent enough. But that niece of his, there's something odd about her eyes. Don't you think, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple smiled. "Perhaps only the look of someone who's seen too much city smoke, my dear. Fresh air will cure it." But privately, she was not so sure. A few days later, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor, Miss Clara Avery herself. The girl arrived just after tea, her gloves damp from rain and her expression anxious but determined. "I'm sorry to trouble you, Miss Marple," she said, her voice soft, almost musical. "My uncle speaks so kindly of the village, and everyone says you know, well, everything worth knowing." Miss Marple laughed lightly. "Oh, my dear, they exaggerate dreadfully. Do sit down." Clara perched on the edge of the armchair, twisting her handkerchief in her fingers. "There's something strange about the house," she said at last. "At night, I hear footsteps, not in the corridor, but outside, in the garden, just beneath the drawing-room window." Miss Marple's knitting paused in mid-air. "The drawing-room window?" "Yes. The one that faces the roses. My uncle says it's nonsense, that it's only the wind. But I'm sure I heard someone, or something, walking there." The old lady's eyes softened, though her mind began to turn like a quiet machine. "Old houses hold echoes, my dear. But tell me, do you see anything when you look out?" Clara hesitated. "Once. I thought I saw a handprint. Faint, on the glass. But when I looked again, it was gone." Miss Marple's smile didn't falter, but a cold ripple moved beneath her calm expression. "Perhaps," she said gently, "it is only the past remembering itself. Still, if you should hear it again, do not be afraid. Some memories simply wish to be acknowledged, before they fade for good." That night, long after Clara had gone, Miss Marple sat awake by her lamp, the fire burning low. Rain tapped softly on the windowpane, and for a fleeting instant, she thought she saw it too, a faint smudge on the glass, shaped like the curve of a hand. She blinked. It was gone. But her heart, wise and steady, told her the story of Marlecombe was not quite over. Not yet. Chapter 18. The Shape in the Fog. The fog came early that evening, thick, low, and white as milk, curling around Marlecombe's lanes like an animal that meant to stay. Even the church bell sounded muffled, as if the air itself had turned to cloth. Lamps glowed like distant coins, and the cottages seemed to float in clouds. From her sitting-room window, Miss Marple could just make out the vague outline of Harcourt House across the valley. Its windows gleamed faintly through the haze, one upstairs light burning longer than the rest. She poured herself a cup of tea and watched. The world was hushed, the only sound the steady tick of the clock. Then, faintly, from across the fog, a cry. It wasn't a scream, nor even loud. But it carried a note of shock, almost disbelief, before fading back into silence. Miss Marple set her cup down. Within minutes, she had her shawl, her lantern, and her walking stick, and was making her careful way down the lane. Her breath formed small clouds in the cold. By the time she reached Harcourt House, the fog was so thick she could barely see the front gate until her hand brushed against it. The garden lay silent, the roses now black skeletons against the pale air. A light moved suddenly in the upper window, a flicker, then darkness again. Miss Marple stood still, listening. Then, unmistakably, came the sound of footsteps on the gravel path, slow, deliberate, and far too measured to be the wind. "Who's there?" she called softly. Her voice barely carried a few feet. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence, until a shape emerged from the fog. A tall figure in a long coat, the collar turned up. The lantern's glow caught the gleam of buttons, military buttons. "Colonel Avery," she said in quiet relief. He nodded stiffly. "Miss Marple, what on earth are you doing out in this weather?" "I might ask you the same, Colonel. I heard a cry from the house." His expression changed, barely, but enough for her to see the flicker of concern. That must have been Clara. She's been frightened by shadows tonight. I've told her it's the wind. But as they turned toward the house, Miss Marple noticed something on the windowpane by the terrace, a faint smudge, circular, almost like a fingerprint. The fog made it glisten, pale and ghostly. Without thinking, she reached out and touched it. The glass was cold, damp, and oddly clean, as though someone had wiped it moments before. Inside, Clara sat near the fire, her face pale and tear-streaked. "Oh, Miss Marple," she gasped. "I'm so glad you came. I saw it again, the handprint. And then, outside the window, a figure moving through the fog. I thought—" Her uncle interrupted sharply. "Nonsense, my dear. You've let the village gossip and that dreadful story about the Harcourts unsettle you." But Miss Marple's eyes never left his face. "Perhaps," she said mildly. "Though one might also say the house itself has a long memory. You see, Colonel, certain stories have a way of repeating themselves when the truth has been left unfinished." He looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" But Miss Marple only smiled. "Nothing at all, Colonel. Only that fog, like guilt, is best faced with the light left on." When she left the house, the fog was thinning. The moon hung faintly above the trees, turning the damp air to silver. Miss Marple paused once more by the window. The glass was clear now, perfectly so. Yet she knew what she had seen. As she walked back to her cottage, she hummed softly, her mind turning over small details, a hesitation in the Colonel's voice, the smudge on the glass, Clara's terror, and the way the fog had come up so suddenly. "The past," she whispered to herself, "is not content to stay buried. It always returns, though sometimes it borrows a new name." Chapter 19. The Letter in the Desk Drawer. 2 mornings after the fog, Miss Marple received an unexpected note. It was written in neat, uncertain handwriting on thick cream paper. "Dear Miss Marple, I am so sorry to trouble you again, but I find myself in need of your advice. I cannot speak of it to my uncle. Might you come this afternoon? Yours sincerely, Clara Avery." The handwriting trembled ever so slightly, not enough to betray panic, but enough to suggest that Miss Clara Avery had slept little and worried much. Miss Marple folded the note carefully, slipped it into her knitting basket, and went about her morning with the quiet precision of one who never wasted time, but always used it. By 3:30, she was walking the lane toward Harcourt House. The sky was low and grey, with a light drizzle falling. The smell of damp earth and wood smoke hung in the air. When the maid opened the door, she looked uneasy. "Miss Clara's in the study, The Colonel's gone out." The house felt different, heavier somehow, as if the air itself carried secrets. The fire in the study burned low. Clara stood near the writing desk, her face pale but her eyes resolute. "Thank you for coming," she said, clasping her hands. I've found something. I don't quite know what to make of it." She went to the desk, a fine old oak piece, polished and heavy. One of the drawers was half open. Inside lay a small bundle of papers tied with faded blue ribbon. Clara untied it slowly, as if performing a delicate surgery. Among the yellowed pages and receipts was a single envelope marked for Eleanor, "Only if I am gone." Miss Marple's brows lifted slightly. "Eleanor Harcourt," she said quietly. "Yes," Clara whispered. It was hidden beneath a false panel in the drawer. I found it when the key got stuck. The letter inside was brief, a man's hand, firm and elegant. Miss Marple read silently. My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, then the matter has gone wrong, and I must trust to your wisdom. I have discovered what Leonard has done, not to you, but to the family name. There will be questions. Do not fear the truth, however bitter it may be. And if the window bears my print, know that I came not to harm, but to protect. Yours always, A.H. Clara looked bewildered. A.H. That isn't Leonard Harcourt. Then who? Miss Marple tapped the paper gently. Arthur Harcourt, she murmured. Leonard's younger brother. He was said to have died abroad 10 years ago. But apparently, he returned, quietly. They sat in silence, the letter between them like a fragile ghost. Outside, the drizzle turned to steady rain. Miss Marple spoke softly. You see, my dear, this changes things. The police believed Leonard's death was domestic, a quarrel turned violent. But this, she nodded to the letter, suggests another story. One of protection, not hatred. Clara frowned. But what could he have been protecting her from? Miss Marple's eyes went distant for a moment. Ah, that is the question, isn't it? A question of inheritance, perhaps, or shame. And one that Colonel Avery might prefer remain buried. Clara's breath caught. You think my uncle? I think, Miss Marple interrupted gently, that your uncle knows more about the Harcourts than he has chosen to say, and that his sudden tenancy here was no coincidence. She rose slowly, tucking the letter into her handbag. We shall keep this safe for now. But my dear, say nothing to your uncle. Not until we are certain what hand truly left that print on the window. Clara nodded, her face pale but resolute. That evening, as Miss Marple walked home under her umbrella, she thought of the initials, A.H., and of another faint memory, a young soldier once seen in a photograph in Mrs. Harcourt's parlour, smiling in uniform beside his brother. Arthur Harcourt, she whispered. Not dead, then, and perhaps not innocent either. Thunder rolled far away across the downs. The rain began to fall harder, tapping on her umbrella like fingers against glass. And in that rhythm, Miss Marple thought she heard an answer forming, quiet, patient, waiting to be revealed. Chapter 20. The Colonel's Past. By the following morning, the rain had passed, leaving Marlecombe washed clean and glistening. The hedgerows sparkled with droplets, and the churchyard smelled of wet stone and moss. Miss Marple, however, felt no peace in the fine weather. The letter from Arthur Harcourt lay in her knitting basket, its secret pressing on her thoughts like a weight too delicate yet too important to set down. She had lived long enough to know that truth, once unearthed, often carried splinters. After luncheon, she paid a polite call to Colonel Avery, carrying with her a small jar of plum jam, an excellent reason, she thought, for calling upon anyone without arousing curiosity. The Colonel received her in the drawing-room, his manner courteous as ever, though his eyes, sharp and calculating, betrayed unease. Miss Marple, he said warmly, you are most kind. I was just thinking how few decent preserves one can find outside the villages. She smiled, setting the jar upon the mantel. I always think a spoonful of something sweet helps us see life more clearly, don't you, Colonel? His smile faltered for a fraction of a second, and that was all she needed. They spoke of harmless things, the weather, the rector's new sermon, the poor state of the post road, until Miss Marple, with deceptive casualness, said, You must find it strange, living here, in a house with such a history. His hand, which had been steady upon his teacup, paused in mid-air. History, Miss Marple. Oh yes. These old houses do tend to remember things, you know. Ghosts of former quarrels, and so forth. Why, I dare say you know all about the Harcourt's tragedy. A flicker crossed his eyes, not quite fear, but recognition. Unfortunate business, he said shortly. I've no interest in dwelling on it. Of course not, Miss Marple replied, her voice mild as milk. Though it is curious how certain names linger. I came across a mention of an Arthur Harcourt the other day, a soldier, I believe. Wasn't he in your regiment, Colonel? For a long moment, silence filled the room. Then, slowly, the Colonel set down his cup. Yes, he said at last. Arthur Harcourt served under my command in France. Brave man. Too brave, perhaps. He didn't return. Miss Marple's eyes, calm and blue, rested upon him. Didn't return, or didn't wish to be found. The Colonel's jaw tightened. You've been speaking to my niece. I've spoken to no one who hasn't already spoken to their conscience, she said gently. But I think, perhaps, you know more of this story than anyone else alive. He rose abruptly and went to the window, that window, the same one that had once borne the ghostly handprint. The light through the glass fell in narrow stripes across his face. I owed Arthur Harcourt a debt, he said finally, his voice low. He saved my life in France. When he returned to England, he was broken, in spirit and in honor. There were whispers about missing funds, accusations that were never proved. He begged me for help. I thought I'd done right by him, but it seems I failed him in the end. Miss Marple said nothing. She knew that silence was often the best prod to confession. After a pause, he continued, Arthur came here, to Marlecombe, not long before the murder. He said he meant to see his brother, to settle a matter once and for all. I told him not to. That nothing good ever came of digging up the past. He didn't listen. He turned, meeting her eyes. You believe he killed Leonard, don't you? Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. I believe that when a man loves his family, he may do desperate things, and that when guilt runs in the blood, it stains more than one generation. Tell me, Colonel, is that why you took this house? To guard the truth. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. To guard her. Miss Marple nodded slowly. She needed no further explanation. Her, meaning Clara. Meaning the young woman who bore more resemblance to the Harcourts than anyone had noticed. When she returned home, Miss Marple lit a fire and sat quietly, her thoughts knitting together more quickly than her needles ever could. Colonel Avery, once Captain Avery, had served with Arthur Harcourt. Clara, then, was not his niece but Arthur's daughter, hidden under a new name. The Averys had come to Marlecombe not by chance, but by inheritance, and perhaps by unfinished business. The pieces were falling into place. Yet one question still hung, cold and sharp. If Arthur Harcourt had not killed his brother, then who had? Miss Marple rose, went to the window, and looked out at the twilight. Her reflection stared back, pale and thoughtful, against the faint shimmer of the glass. The handprint, she murmured. Yes, it was never about who left it, but what it was trying to hide. And for the first time in many weeks, her pulse quickened. There was one person still unaccounted for in the tale, and she meant to find them before the truth vanished into the fog once more.